Greetings, software language engineers, and welcome to the next talk of this conference called There is More Than One Way to Zen Your Python. This is about a paper with the same name. If you want to know what's in the paper, please go read it, and I will try in the remaining time to provide some context, to provide some reasons for us to do research, this research and some other research in this particular domain, this particular topic, and hopefully give enough meat for the discussion that follows. This paper was written by Amir Farouk, who was a student at the University of Twente and recently successfully graduated with his bachelor diploma and received the Best Paper Award at the local student conference. And yours truly, Vadim, and I'm a professor of software evolution and the same University of Twente. So software evolution is about changing the software that already exists, but I'm somewhat of a software language engineer myself. So how does that combine together? Well, I think very nicely. There are a lot of things, a lot of questions that you can ask in research about things that are already existing and need to change over time for some reason or one reason or another, and the software language engineering where you're focused on the languages themselves. So for instance, what happens to languages after they are engineered? I love engineering languages and making new domain-specific languages just like the next SLE participant, but what happens after you have made the language, you've let it out to the world, you have users now, what do they do with the language, how do you deal with that? Once you have the language, once you have language users, they have certain patterns of how they use the language and what kind of problems they use with this, and how do these patterns evolve over time, what happens with them when language gets used more and more. That brings us to the domain of this particular research, which is something that I call coding traditions. I needed an umbrella term for many things like code idioms, right? So this is, for example, a list comprehension. This is Python syntax, but it exists in many other languages. And in Python, it is considered the way to make a list out of something that is possible to iterate over, right? So in some other languages, a list comprehension is just as decent as, for instance, using a map. And in some other languages, you need to, make an empty array and then keep adding things to it, sort of the Fortran style. Well, that definitely will be considered non-Pythonic and non-idiomatic in Python and in many other languages. You can have implementation patterns, something like caching, where you have a data coming in a data flow, which validity extends beyond the point of this one method call, and then you have some machinery to preserve this. You can have on a very low level some calling conventions, which you might think are hidden somewhere inside the compiler and nobody should care, but compiler makers are people too. And several years ago, when I was at Raincode, we had quite a lot of fun and a lot of challenge implementing this when assembler programs, IBM assembler programs, were calling PL1 programs on the mainframe. And we needed to make sure that the byte representations of all the data structures are exactly as they were on the mainframe, because, assembler programs, even if you run them on a different platform, they count on the bits and bytes to be in the right places. You can have a coding tradition of naming things, something like using a camel case. You can have it with Twitter tags about conferences. Formatting conventions, where the unending holy war, where do you put the opening curly on the next line as a decent being and developer, or on the end of the previous line like some kind of savage. You can have code snippets as a very, very advanced way of doing basically user-driven, user-specified code completion. You can have micro-patterns, like they are somewhat like implementation patterns, but they're called micro-patterns because you can literally immediately see them or implement them or generate them for your particular language. And of course, you can have templates in front-end languages. They are omnipresent and has existed for a long while, but they're slowly creeping into some other languages as well. You can also have negative coding traditions like copy-paste programming when you're creating duplication, cargo code programming when you are copying some piece of code or following some tradition without knowing why are you following this. You can have it on the project level when you are having a death march project from the day one. You know that you will be over budget, but you still go on. On the debugging level, when you, for instance, don't know what you are precisely looking for and doing, so you try changing different things in random places. It's called shotgun debugging. You can engage in premature optimization, which is, as we know, the root of all evil. And of course, there is an unending huge area there about code smell. So some people consider code duplication as well a code smell, and there are many, many more of those. Here's a couple of concrete examples of what you can do with coding traditions. Maybe they will inspire you to also do some research in this area. When in an industrial context we were migrating people from the mainframe with their assembler programs, we used the usage patterns of the language to heavily optimize the compiler and give people the performance that they needed. In Python, we have seen that developers sometimes use language features as they are instead of doing some code smells like they do in Java. In this case, we used, it's a 4GL, fourth generation language. We use the specific things about that language in order to make different parsing techniques that again satisfy the performance needs. In this one, we migrated people from a particular 4GL by translating it to a completely different language in a completely different paradigm. But if we follow the idioms, then they are on a slightly higher level than the language, so then it works. In CSS, we have seen that these idioms and these traditions can help you to find places to refactor your code and to make your website more efficient. Finally, some SLE papers, right? So micropatterns in grammars are symptoms of technical spaces where these grammars were initially made in. And in this one, we have had the IDE support that is centered around different usage conventions of a language. And of course, we also trying to use some machine learning to get the code patterns from the sources. We had some pragmatic reasons to use Python for this research because, well, according to some metrics, Python has already been a #1 language in their use, not counting COBOL probably. And just recently, really a couple of days ago, Tiobe also updated their website and said that now C and Java are no more at the top of the list. Well, they're towards the top of the list, but #1 is also Python. But that's not the only reasons. Python has this notion of Pythonicity that is very deeply ingrained in the language. So if you run the Python interpreter and you say import this, then you get this list of very nice things called the Zen of Python, hence also the name of our paper. And it has some things that are more concrete when you say that explicit is better than implicit, or that errors should never pass silently. That's quite checkable. And there are some other things like, well, beautiful is better than ugly. Who would argue against that? I don't know. But in general, this is there is this feeling in the community that this is very important and that this is something that they can engage in and can enforce. There has been this wonderful paper, not written by me, but some other very good researchers, and they have investigated a couple of years ago, also at Splash, the usage of Pythonic idioms. So it was the first, as far as I know, and as far as they know as well, the first study, the scientific academic study of Pythonicity in general. They did the interviews with the developers. They saw some concrete idioms that they could literally detect in the code. They, in general, talked about the shared culture and had this discussion of the code level Pythonicity versus the cultural level. And they made this website with the catalogue of idioms. What we have done here, basically, we performed the replication. We wanted to see if their research results are still relevant, if they can be confirmed by us. We used the grounded theory to get even more idioms from different sources. We have an updated catalog. We've also put some other stuff in there, and we've tracked the evolution in time of these idioms. For the replication part, read the details in the paper, a lot of details there. The TLDR version of this, yes, it worked fine. There we replicated most of the results. All the differences are sort of due to the fact that this was a couple of years ago. Some of the project died and some of the other projects came into existence. But in general, the numbers sort of matched. We had collaborated it on modern data, and we've even added some more detectors just to see if we can do that. For the grounded theory part, we basically went to the internets and looked at blogs and Stack Overflow discussions and whatnot to see what kind of books people advise to read to Python developers, specifically in the context of discussions about Pythonicity. So we came up with these books, and we disregarded this book of Learning Python the Hard Way because, well, it did not contain any new, any concrete scenarios, but it had more of a discussions of the application of the existing ones. And the first one was really focused on specific scenarios of using the patterns, not the patterns themselves. This is our website, and the example of one of the descriptions of the idioms, of the traditions there, of how it evolved over time, how people were formatting strings in Python in the last century, where I also started programming in Python, how it evolved when we had some specific way to format things, and how people are doing it now, with of course references to the PEPs and with to the books that mentioned it. According to the patterns, again, if you want more detail, look at the paper, but 3 interesting patterns that we have seen. One was this unceasing growth of the use of a Pythonic idiom, right? So this is bean counting, right? So we are just detecting how many list comprehensions are in the code. So in particular for list comprehensions, obviously, if you're using it and if you're writing more code, you would want to use it more in that code. So the more code you have, the more list comprehensions you have in your code. With join, for instance, you had this hype curve like things as, you know, the peak of expectations and then eventually the plateau of productivity. So you had this peak when it was just introduced. In the next couple of months, people were using joins all over the place, and at some point they found some other ways probably to deal with their problems. And then there were some patterns that sort of reached a saturation point slowly. So for instance, when you're using some data structure like a named tuple or a counter, well, you introduce it, right? And then you keep using it. And the more code you have, the more uses of that you have. But it's not necessarily that we can count the number of uses of data structure, right? So to conclude, there are some useful links here. We have the catalog, it's online. We have the paper with a lot of results which you can read, and some of the concrete diagrams we've just put into on Figshare as a separate thing. And we also have an artifact that's related to this paper. Replication worked, so kudos to the original authors. Everything was fine, and most of the problems that we've experienced was just because we needed to have a look at their code, and we are not them. So, but beyond that, it was relatively easy to set it up and to extend. And if you don't have any good questions to ask, then consider thinking or discussing things like using idioms versus using the language features as such. Some people might argue that if you just say use list comprehensions is a good thing, it's not an idiom. It's just telling people to use what is already there. And you're right to a certain extent, but apparently in Python at least, this is what people are advising, and this is what people are considering Pythonic. And of course, there is a huge discussion that we can have about the code level versus cultural level, the terminology from the original paper on the usage of Pythonic idioms. Can we actually draw any conclusions at all that are sensible from just looking at code and counting how many times certain things were used versus using the high-level discussions with code reviews, for instance. Thank you for your attention, and let's have some good discussion.